Independence Day is the day we celebrate our freedom and the ideals on which our nation was founded. Today is a special day for Cubans who won their formal independence with help from the United States 107 years ago today. Today is Independence Day in Cuba. It serves as a reminder that there are those still struggling to exercise their fundamental rights, having spent the past 50 years under the repressive rule of one family regime. Last month, 17 peaceful Cuban activists wrote to President Obama noting that, and I quote, "A great majority of Cubans desire profound democratic change in Cuba. The shining example of the civil rights movement in the United States is a beacon of hope so that the full dignity of each Cuban can be restored. We want to determine our future through a democratic process." This administration has taken actions with the well-being of Cubans in mind. While I appreciate the President's willingness to address some of the challenges facing the Cuban people, I also ask that he consider implementing policies that will empower the Cuban people, not embolden the regime. Wholesale change in Cuba won't come from Washington. Change for Havana can only come from Havana. The Cuban people will not truly be free until all prisoners of conscience are freed from prison. Additionally, the regime must end the practice of harassing and detaining those who exercise their fundamental human rights. The Cuban people are also entitled to freedom of the press, freedom to assemble, freedom to worship. And finally, the Cuban people must be given the right to freely choose who governs them and how they will be governed. On the day we recognize Cuba's independence from Spain 107 years ago, we should also recognize the Cuban people's right to independence from the repressive regime that currently denies them these fundamental freedoms. 107 years ago, as the United States and those freedom fighters in Cuba who had struggled mightily for more than a quarter of a century by that time to free themselves from the yoke of colonialism, the United States and Cuba, after freeing Cuba from Spain, sat together to form the new Cuban Republic. And 107 years ago, on a day like today, the United States ceded to the Cuban people its right to be an independent nation. It is amazing how nurtured and closely bound together the history of our nation is with the history of the nation that saw my birth. And it is with that in mind that the unique role in the fact that only a very small body of water called the Florida Straits separates us has created this entangled web of history between these two nations that have so much been a part of my life. So as we look to the future, it is right that we continue to be the greatest single beacon of hope, as these dissidents expressed to President Obama, for those in Cuba who look for freedom, who look for the opportunity to have a democratic government that they can elect. Today, the Cuban people continue to be ruled by the tyrannical hand of two brothers who seized power in 1959 on January the 1st. That is a long time ago, Mr. President. And since that day until today, there has not been a legitimate election. There has never been the opportunity for the Cuban people to freely express themselves without the fear of repression or political prison. Today, that there are dozens of Cuban people who are in prison merely for expressing the ideas that this country has so nurtured over the time of its existence: freedom, democracy, rule of law. And it is with that hope that today I wanted to come to the Senate floor to commemorate this very important date on the calendar of the history that intertwines Cuba and the United States.